The morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains like it had for 37 years in this house. But today it illuminated an empty jewelry box where my mother's pearl necklace should have been resting. My arthritic fingers trembled as I lifted the burgundy velvet interior, searching beneath the faded silk lining as if the necklace might be hiding there. Playing some cruel game of hide-and-seek with my failing memory. But I knew, deep in the hollow of my chest where grief had carved out a permanent residence since Harold passed 2 years ago, I knew exactly what had happened. The same sick certainty that had been growing like a tumor for months now, fed by small disappearances and casual cruelties, finally metastasized into this moment of awful clarity. I sank onto the edge of my bed, the floral comforter Harold had complained about for decades now, a comfort against my trembling legs. The necklace had been my mother's and her mother's before that. It's passed down through 3 generations of women who had worn it to their weddings, their children's graduations, their husbands' funerals. The pearls had been cultured in the waters off Japan in 1923. A wedding gift from my grandfather to my grandmother when such luxuries were rare and precious beyond measure. "Mom, are you up?" Jessica's voice drifted up the stairs, artificially bright in that way she'd perfected since moving in with Michael and the kids. After their foreclosure, "I'm making coffee." I wanted to call back, to demand she come upstairs immediately and explain the empty jewelry box. Instead, I found myself smoothing down my gray hair and reaching for my robe, my body moving through the motions of normalcy while my mind reeled with the implications of what I'd discovered. At 74, I had become an expert at swallowing indignities, choosing battles I might actually win. The hardwood floors creaked familiar protests under my slippered feet as I made my way downstairs, each step a small symphony of age and wear. The house that had once echoed with Harold's laughter and Michael's childhood adventures now felt cavernous and foreign, filled with Jessica's aggressive cheerfulness and the children's noise that somehow managed to be both overwhelming and utterly lonely. "There she is." Jessica beamed at me from behind the kitchen island, her blonde hair pulled back in that perfect ponytail she somehow managed to achieve even at 7 in the morning. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine about suburban motherhood, all yoga pants and coordinated athleisure, stark contrast to my worn robe and the weight of grief that seemed to follow me like a shadow. "I thought we could go grocery shopping together today. Make a real day of it." 8-year-old Emma looked up from her bowl of cereal, milk dribbling down her chin, while 5-year-old Jake continued his systematic destruction of a piece of toast. Crumbs scattered across the table like confetti from a celebration I hadn't been invited to. My grandchildren, Harold's legacy, now felt like strangers living in my home. "Where's Michael?" I asked, settling into my usual chair at the kitchen table, the same spot where Harold and I had shared 37 years of morning coffee and quiet conversation. "Already at work," Jessica replied, that bright tone never wavering as she poured coffee into a mug I didn't recognize. Everything in my kitchen seemed to be slowly transforming into versions of itself that I didn't choose, didn't want, couldn't control. "You know how dedicated he is to that new account?" T didn't know. Michael had been working longer hours since the move, staying late at the office, coming home exhausted and distant. I wanted to believe it was just the stress of their financial situation, the embarrassment of a 35-year-old man having to move back in with his widowed mother. But there were other explanations, darker possibilities that kept me awake. At night, staring at the ceiling Harold would never again share. "Jessica," I began, wrapping my hands around the unfamiliar mug for warmth. "I can't seem to find my mother's pearl necklace. You haven't seen it, have you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire someone forgot to tend. Jessica's smile never faltered. but something shifted behind her eyes. It's a barely perceptible tightening around the corners that I might have missed if I hadn't spent decades reading faces. It's interpreting the subtle signals of human deception. Your pearl necklace, she repeated, tilting her head with practiced concern. The one you keep in your jewelry box? Yes, that one. It was my mother's. Jessica turned back to the coffee maker, busying herself with wiping down counters that were already clean. I haven't seen it. Maybe you moved it somewhere safe and forgot. You know how that happens sometimes? It's the casual cruelty of the suggestion hit me like a slap. Yes, I was 74. Yes, I sometimes forgot where I put my reading glasses or whether I'd turned off the stove. But I would never, ever forget where I kept my mother's necklace. It had lived in the same spot in my jewelry box for 4 decades, nested in its original silk-lined compartment like a prayer I said every morning when I opened the box to choose my earrings. I didn't move it, I said quietly. But Jessica had already turned toward the children, launching into an elaborate discussion about what kind of cereal they wanted her to buy at the store, effectively ending our conversation before it could develop into anything resembling the truth. I sat there sipping coffee from a mug that didn't belong to me, watching my daughter-in-law orchestrate the morning chaos with the efficiency of a general commanding troops, and felt something inside me begin to crystallize. It wasn't quite anger yet, more like the potential for anger, a seed of rage that had been planted months ago and was finally beginning to sprout. The signs had been there, of course. Small things at first. A silver picture frame that used to sit on the mantel, now mysteriously absent, explained away with a casual, "Oh, that old thing. I'd put it somewhere safe while we were cleaning." My grandmother's china teacups, the ones with the delicate rose pattern, had disappeared from the dining room cabinet one afternoon while I was napping. When I'd asked about them, Jessica had looked genuinely puzzled, suggesting perhaps I'd lent them to a friend and forgotten. Each incident had been small enough to doubt, explained away just plausibly enough to make me question my own memory, my own perception of reality. But the necklace was different. The necklace was the line I hadn't even realized I'd drawn in the sand until someone had crossed it. "Grandma Eleanor, will you read to me?" Emma appeared at my elbow, clutching a picture book about a princess and a dragon, her face still sticky. "With breakfast. Course, sweetheart," I managed, grateful for the distraction from my spiraling thoughts. We settled together on the living room couch, Emma's warm little body pressed against my side as I opened the familiar pages. But even as I read about brave princesses and magical kingdoms, part of my mind was calculating, remembering, piecing together a pattern I'd been too polite, too accommodating, too grateful for their presence to see clearly. The afternoon stretched ahead of me. It's like a desert I wasn't sure I had the strength to cross. Jessica had indeed insisted on the grocery shopping expedition. It's turning what had once been a simple errand into an elaborate production involving lists and coupons and discussions about organic produce that seemed designed to highlight my own incompetence and outdated ways of doing things. "Oh, Eleanor, you can't buy that brand," she'd said, plucking a box of laundry detergent from my hands at Kroger. "Don't you know about all the chemicals? We really need to be more conscious about what we're bringing into the house, especially with the children." The house? My house. The house Harold and I had bought when Michael was 2 years old, where we'd raised our son and hosted countless dinner parties and Christmas mornings. Somehow, over the past 6 months, it had become the house in Jessica's vocabulary, shared space where she was the expert and I was the aging relative who needed gentle correction and constant supervision. I'd bitten my tongue and nodded, letting her replace my choices with organic alternatives that cost twice as much and seemed to carry an implicit judgment about everything I'd done wrong for the past 7 decades. It was easier than arguing, Easier than making a scene in aisle 7 while other shoppers pretended not to notice. The family drama unfolding over fabric softener. But the necklace changed everything. The necklace was a bridge too far, a violation, too profound to explain away with concerns about my memory or suggestions that I'd simply misplaced something precious. That evening, after the children were finally in bed and Jessica had retreated to what used to be Harold's study to work on her laptop, found myself standing in front of my bedroom mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. When had I become so small? When had I started apologizing for taking up space in my own home? I thought about my mother, who had worn the pearl necklace to every important occasion of her adult life. She'd been a teacher in an era when married women were expected to quit their jobs, but she'd fought to keep working, to maintain her independence and her identity beyond wife and mother. She'd worn those pearls like armor, a reminder of her own worth in a world that constantly questioned it. And I'd let her legacy disappear without even a fight. The next morning brought no relief. It's only a deeper settling of dread in my stomach as I went through the motions of breakfast and small talk. Michael had come home late again, kissing Jessica hello with the distracted affection of a man whose mind was elsewhere, ruffling the children's hair before disappearing into the shower and then back out the door with barely a word to me. I waited until Jessica had left for her yoga class, till the house was finally quiet except for the familiar creaks and sighs of old wood settling, to where I picked up the phone and called Mrs. Patterson next door. Grace Patterson had been my friend for 23 years, ever since she and her husband moved in after retiring from their respective careers in education. She was one of the few people left who remembered Harold, who had known me before I became the confused old woman who misplaced precious jewelry. "Grace, it's Eleanor," I said when she answered on the third ring. "Eleanor. How are you holding up?" "Dear, I've been meaning to come by, but I didn't want to intrude with all the family staying with you." Family. The word felt strange and hollow, like an echo of something that used to have meaning. "Grace, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you noticed anyone coming to my house when I'm not there? Any unusual activity?" There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that speaks volumes, about internal calculations and social propriety, warring with the urge to tell the truth. "Eleanor, why do you ask?" Some things have gone missing. Important things, I think. I think Jessica might be taking them." The words hung between us like a confession, and saying them out loud made them real in a way that thinking them had not. I was accusing my daughter-in-law of theft. I was admitting that the family I'd welcomed into my home might be systematically robbing me. "Oh, honey." Grace's voice was soft with sympathy and something else, something that sounded like confirmation. "I did see a young woman leaving your house yesterday afternoon, right after you and Jessica got back from shopping. She was carrying what looked like a small bag. Assumed it was someone Jessica knew, maybe a friend picking something up." My heart sank even as part of me felt vindicated. A friend of Jessica's, leaving with a small bag, the right size for jewelry, for precious things that could be easily transported and quickly converted to cash. What did she look like? Blonde, like Jessica, but younger. Maybe She got into a red car parked at the end of your driveway. I thanked Grace and hung up, my hands shaking as I set the phone back in its cradle. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity, painting a picture I didn't want to see, but could no longer deny. Jessica wasn't just taking things. She was selling them, probably through friends or acquaintances who could pawn them without raising suspicions. The front door opened with Jessica's characteristic flourish, her voice carrying from the foyer as she called out her return from yoga. Her tone bright and energetic in that way that had begun to sound increasingly false to my ears. "Eleanor, picked up those vitamins you wanted from the pharmacy. I met her in the kitchen, watching as she unpacked a small white bag with theatrical attention to detail, explaining the benefits of each supplement as if I were a child who needed to understand why vegetables were good for me. All the while, I studied her face, looking for signs of guilt or deception. Jessica had perfected the art of performance over the months she'd lived in my house. "Jessica," I said when she finally paused for breath, "I've been thinking more about my mother's necklace." Her hand stilled for just a moment over the vitamin bottles. It's a barely perceptible hesitation that might have been nothing or might have been everything. "Oh, right. Any luck finding it?" "I'm wondering if maybe I should call the police, in case someone broke in." It was quite valuable. This time the reaction was unmistakable. Jessica's face went pale beneath her yoga glow, and she actually took a step backward, as if I'd physically struck her. "The police! Eleanor, don't you think that's a bit dramatic? I mean, you haven't even looked everywhere yet." "Maybe we should. Search the house more thoroughly first." "I have looked everywhere, Jessica. Everywhere it could possibly be. The only explanation is that someone took it." The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and I could see Jessica's mind working, calculating her next move. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its artificial brightness, replaced by something sharper, more desperate. "Eleanor, I have to say this is really hurtful. It's the way you're implying ... I mean, we're family. We're here, taking care of you, making sure you're not alone in this big house, and this is how you repay us, with accusations and suspicion." The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost bought it. Almost let myself be convinced that I was the problem, that my grief and loneliness had made me paranoid and cruel. But then I thought about my mother's face the last time she'd worn those pearls. It's to Harold's funeral, how she'd pressed them into my hands afterward and told me to save them for special occasions. "I'm not making accusations," I said quietly. "I'm simply stating facts. The necklace is missing. It was valuable. The police should be notified." Jessica's mask slipped completely then, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. "Fine, call the police. But when they find out it was probably just misplaced by a confused old woman, don't expect me to be sympathetic. And don't expect Michael to be either. He's already worried about your memory, We both are. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not just the insult, but the threat implicit in her words. She was telling me that she'd already been planting seeds with Michael, preparing him to doubt his own mother's sanity if it became necessary to protect herself. "Get out," I said, the words coming from some place deep inside me that I'd forgotten existed. "Excuse me? Get out of my kitchen. Get out of my house. All of you." Jessica laughed, but it was a sharp, brittle sound with no humor in it. "Eleanor, be reasonable. You can't just throw us out. We have nowhere else to go. And frankly, you need us more than we need you. Who's going to take care of you when you start forgetting to turn off the stove or wander out of the house in your nightgown?" The picture she painted was my worst nightmare. It's the gradual dissolution of self that I'd watched claim to many of my friends over the years. But I realized in that moment that there were worse things than losing my independence. There were worse things than being alone. I said, "Get out. It's time." My voice carried enough conviction that Jessica actually took another step backward. But she wasn't finished with me yet. "You know what? Fine. We'll leave. But don't come crying to us when you realize what a mistake you've made. And don't expect Michael to choose you over his wife and children, 'cause that's what this is really about, isn't it? You're jealous that he has a new family now, that he doesn't need his mommy anymore." Each word was designed to wound, to find the soft spots in my armor and press until I bled. And they worked, because part of what she said was true. I was jealous. I was lonely. I did miss being needed, being central to my son's life instead of a burden to be managed and a resource to be exploited. But none of that changed the fact that my mother's necklace was gone, or that Jessica was responsible for its disappearance. "You have 1 week," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "It's 1 week to find somewhere else to live." Jessica's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally a kind of cold resolve that was somehow more frightening than her previous theatrics. "It was just sitting there," she said finally, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. "Kay, in that jewelry box, never worn, never appreciated. Just sitting there like everything else in this mausoleum you call a home. At least now it's doing some good, helping people who actually need it instead of gathering dust as a shrine to your dead mother." The confession hit me like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because of its casual cruelty. She'd stolen from me and felt justified in doing so, had convinced herself that my attachment to my mother's memory was somehow selfish, that my grief was an inconvenience that gave her the right to dispose of my most precious possessions. "Where is it?" I whispered. "It's gone. Sold. The money went toward Emma's dance lessons and Jake's soccer registration. Things that matter to living people, not dead ones." I felt something break inside me then, not just my heart, but something deeper, more fundamental. The trust I'd extended to this woman, the family bond I'd tried to nurture, it's the benefit of the doubt I'd given her again and again despite mounting evidence of her true nature. "Get out," I said again. But this time, the words carried no emotion at all. I was done arguing, done pleading, done trying to make someone understand. Why the theft of my mother's necklace was about more than money or jewelry or even sentiment. Jessica must have heard something final in my tone because she didn't argue further. Instead, she gathered her yoga mat and car keys and headed toward the front door, pausing only to deliver one final blow. "Michael won't forgive you for this. And when you're sitting alone in this house, wondering why your son never calls anymore, remember that you chose jewelry over family." The front door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the windows, and suddenly the house was quiet, in a way it hadn't been for months. Not the oppressive silence of loneliness, but the peaceful quiet of a space that belonged entirely to me again. I sank into Harold's old recliner and let myself cry for the first time since the morning I'd found the empty jewelry box. I cried for my mother's necklace, for the trust I'd placed in the wrong person, for the family dynamics that had been poisoned beyond repair. But mostly I cried for the version of myself I'd lost somewhere along the way, the woman who would never have tolerated such treatment for 6 months. Would have recognized the signs of manipulation and theft long before they'd escalated to this point. When Michael came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room, my hands folded in my lap and my mind finally clear after hours of tears and reflection. He looked exhausted, older than his 35 years, and for a moment I felt a pang of sympathy for the impossible position I was about to put him in. "Mom, Jessica told me what happened," he said before I could speak, settling heavily onto the couch across from me. "She's pretty upset. I imagine she is. Instead, you accused her of stealing and threw her out of the house." "That's not like you." I studied my son's face, looking for traces of the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and broken toys, who had trusted me to fix everything that went wrong in his small world. That boy was still there somewhere, buried under layers of adult responsibility and marital loyalty, but he felt impossibly distant. "Your wife stole my mother's pearl necklace and sold it," I said simply. "She admitted it to me this afternoon." Michael's face went through the same succession of emotions I'd seen on Jessica's. But his journey ended in denial rather than cold resolve. That's impossible. Jessica wouldn't do that. She knows how much that necklace meant to you, she said. It was just sitting there. That the money went toward the children's activities. Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Maybe she borrowed it or she sold it, Michael. She told me herself, quite clearly, that it was gone and that she felt justified in taking it because it was just gathering dust. The silence that followed was different from the one I'd shared with Jessica. This was the silence of a relationship, hanging in the balance of a son forced to choose between the woman who'd raised him and the woman he'd married. I could see the war playing out behind his eyes, loyalty battling loyalty, love competing with love. Even if that's true, he said finally, we can get it back. We can pay whatever she got for it, and no. The word came out more forcefully than I'd intended, but I didn't soften it. That's not the point, Michael. The point is that she stole from me. The point is that she's been systematically taking things from this house for months, selling them, and manipulating both of us too. Cover her tracks. She's been what? For the first time since he'd walked in, Michael looked genuinely surprised, and I realized that Jessica had been playing us against each other more skillfully than I'd understood. Oh, she'd been feeding him concerns about my memory while stealing from me, positioning herself as the reasonable mediator between a confused old woman and her worried son. The silver picture frame from the mantel, your grandmother's teacups. The first edition of Whitman poems your father gave me for our anniversary. They've all disappeared over the past few months, and every time I asked about them, Jessica had an explanation that made me doubt my own perceptions. I watched recognition dawn on Michael's face, followed quickly by a shame that told me he'd noticed the missing items too, but had accepted Jessica's explanations without question. Perhaps even felt relieved to have someone else manage his aging mother's increasing confusion. Mom, I have asked them to leave, continued before he could finish whatever apology or explanation he was formulating. Jessica has 1 week to find alternative living arrangements. We can't do that. We have nowhere else to go. Right. Not my problem anymore. The words sounded harsh even to my own ears, but they needed to be said. For 6 months, I'd made their problems my problems, their crisis my crisis. I'd opened my home and my heart to a family that had repaid my generosity with theft and manipulation. And I was done pretending that blood relationships and good intentions were enough to overcome its fundamental character flaws. Michael stood up, abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out onto the backyard where he'd played as a child, where Harold had taught him to throw a baseball and ride a bike and all the other rituals of American boyhood. She made a mistake, he said without turning around. People make mistakes when they're desperate, when they feel trapped and don't see any other options. That doesn't make her a bad person. Stealing my mother's necklace and then telling me it was just sitting there gathering dust makes her a bad person. Michael gaslighting me about my own memory makes her a bad person. Treating my home like a resource to be exploited makes her a bad person. He turned around then, and I saw tears in his eyes that matched the ones I'd shed earlier. So what am I supposed to do? Choose between my wife and my mother? 'Cause that's what you're asking me to do. I'm asking you to acknowledge that what she did was wrong. I'm asking you to understand why I can't continue to live this way. I'm not asking you to choose. But we both knew that was exactly what I was asking, and exactly what he would have to do. Jessica had made sure of that with her parting words about Michael never forgiving me, about choosing jewelry over family. She'd set up the situation so that any consequences for her actions would be framed as my cruelty rather than her crimes. The children love it here, Michael said, playing what he knew was his strongest card. They've been through so much with the foreclosure and having to change schools. This is the first stability they've had in months. My grandchildren, the innocent victims of their parents' financial irresponsibility and their mother's criminal behavior. I thought about Emma's face pressed against mine as we read together, about Jake's sticky hugs and unselfconscious affection. They did love it here, and I loved having them here, when their presence wasn't overshadowed by their mother's toxicity. But I also knew that staying would teach them terrible lessons about boundaries and consequences, about what behavior was acceptable within families. They would learn that theft was forgivable if it was committed by someone who claimed to love you, that emotional manipulation was a valid tool for getting what you wanted, that the elderly were fair game for exploitation as long as you called it care. The children are welcome here anytime, I said. You're welcome here anytime, but Jessica is not. Uncle stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to find some middle ground, some compromise that would allow him to avoid the choice I was forcing him to make. But there wasn't one, and we both knew it. Kai, I can't leave my wife, he said. Finally, I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to find somewhere else to live. He nodded slowly, the gesture of a man accepting an inevitable defeat. This will destroy our relationship, you know. Jessica won't forgive this, and she won't let me forget it. Every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone in the kids' lives will be poisoned by this moment. He was probably right, and the knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. But the alternative was to continue living as a victim in my own home, to pretend that theft and manipulation were acceptable prices to pay for the illusion of family harmony. That's Jessica's choice, I said. It's just like stealing my necklace. Was Jessica's choice, and making me doubt my own memory was Jessica's choice. I'm tired of being responsible for the consequences of other people's decisions. Michael left without saying goodbye, and I heard him upstairs packing suitcases, his voice low and urgent as he talked to Jessica on the phone. The children's voices joined the mix eventually, confused and upset by the sudden disruption to their routine. And I had to resist the urge to go upstairs and try to comfort them. To explain that none of this was their fault. Instead, I called Grace Patterson and asked if she could come over. I needed a witness to whatever drama was about to unfold. Someone who could verify later that I'd been reasonable and calm. That I hadn't thrown anyone out in a fit of senile rage or paranoid delusion. Grace arrived just as Jessica's red car pulled into the driveway, and I watched through the front window as my daughter-in-law stalked up the walkway with the determined stride of someone preparing for battle. She looked like she'd been crying, but her tears had been replaced by something harder, more calculated. The next hour was one of the most difficult of my life. Jessica alternated between tearful apologies and vicious attacks, between promises to return the necklace somehow and accusations that I was a bitter old woman destroying her family out of spite. She brought the children into it, using their confusion and distress as weapons against my resolve, making them beg me not to make them leave the only stable home they'd known in months. Through it all, Michael stood silent, a man caught between two women he loved who had declared war on each other. I could see him dying inside with every cruel word Jessica spoke, every sob Emma produced, every time Jake asked why Grandma was being mean to them. But I held firm, even when Jessica played her final card. I'll tell everyone what you've done, she said as Michael loaded the last of their suitcases into their car. I'll make sure the whole family knows that you chose material possessions over your own grandchildren. When you die alone in this house, remember that you had a choice. Grace's presence was a blessing then, because she stepped forward and spoke with the authority of someone who'd witnessed the entire exchange. Young lady, she said to Jessica, her voice carrying the kind of steel that only retired teachers could muster. You stole from this woman and then tried to make her believe she was losing her mind. The only person who made a choice here was you. And it was the wrong one. Jessica's face went white with rage, but she had no answer for Grace's calm certainty. Instead, she herded the children into the car with unnecessary roughness, slamming doors and gunning the engine in a display of impotent fury. Michael was the last to leave, and he paused at my front door with his hand on the knob, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I love you, Mom," he said quietly. "I want you to know that whatever happens next." "I love you too," I replied, and meant it with every fiber of my being. "That's why I can't let this continue." He nodded and walked away, and I watched from the window as their car disappeared down the street, taking with it the last 6 months of my life and any illusion I'd maintained about the sanctity of family bonds. Grace stayed with me until well past midnight, making tea and listening as I alternated between doubt and certainty, between grief for what I'd lost and relief at what I'd escaped. She didn't try to convince me I'd made the right choice or the wrong one. She simply sat with me in the consequences of my decision and let me feel whatever I needed to feel. The house felt different in the days that followed. Not empty exactly, but quiet in a way that was both peaceful and unsettling. I found myself listening for sounds that didn't come: children's laughter, aggressive cheerfulness, Michael's key in the door at the end of long work days. The silence was complete but not oppressive, like the pause between movements. In a symphony, I threw myself into reclaiming my space with an energy I hadn't felt in months. I moved Jessica's organic products out of my kitchen and restocked my pantry with the brands I preferred. I rearranged furniture that had been shifted to accommodate extra bodies and possessions. I put family photos back where they belonged, including several that had mysteriously migrated to less prominent locations during Jessica's residency. Most importantly, Kay began the process of taking inventory of what else was missing. Was longer than I'd expected. Jewelry, books, small antiques, and collectibles that had value but weren't central enough to my daily life for me to notice their absence immediately. Jessica had been methodical in her theft, targeting items that could be easily sold without leaving obvious gaps in my home's landscape. Each discovery was a fresh wound, a new betrayal to process and integrate into my understanding of the woman I'd welcomed into my family. But there was also something liberating about finally seeing the full scope of what had been done to me, about no longer having to doubt my own perceptions or make excuses for someone else's behavior. 2 weeks after they left, Michael called. It was the first contact I'd had with any of them since that awful final night. And I found myself both eager and terrified to hear his voice. "Mom," he said, and I could hear exhaustion in that single syllable. "How are you?" "I'm fine," I replied, though fine was perhaps too simple a word for the complex mixture of emotions I'd been navigating. "How are the children? They miss you. They ask about you every day." The words hit me like a physical blow, because I missed them too, more than I'd allowed myself to acknowledge. I missed Emma's stories about school and her elaborate games of pretend. I missed Jake's constant questions and his boundless energy. I missed being needed by someone who loved me without calculation or agenda. "They can visit any time," I said, though we both knew it wasn't that simple. "Jessica's still pretty angry," Michael said after a pause. "She feels like you humiliated her, like you turned me against her. Did I?" The question hung between us for a long moment. I could almost hear Michael wrestling with how to answer honestly without betraying either the woman who'd raised him or the woman he'd married. "You opened my eyes to some things I didn't want to see," he said finally. "But I'm still married to her, Mom. I still love her, and she's still the mother of my children. I can't just write her off because she made some bad choices when she was desperate." I understood his position, even respected it in some ways. Marriage was about forgiveness and second chances, about weathering storms together and finding ways to move forward despite damage to the foundation. But understanding didn't make it hurt less to know that my son was choosing to stay with someone who'd robbed his mother and felt justified in doing so. "Have you gotten help?" I asked. "Counseling, I mean." "For both of you. We're trying." Jessica's not thrilled about it, but she's agreed to go if it means we can eventually work things out with you. Eventually. The word carried so much weight. So many assumptions about forgiveness and forgetting that I wasn't sure I was capable of meeting. Could I ever trust Jessica again? Could I ever look at her without seeing the moment she'd told me my mother's necklace was just sitting there? Could I ever welcome her back into my home without counting my possessions afterward? "I'm glad you're getting help," I said, because it was true even if I wasn't optimistic about the outcome. "She wants to make amends," Michael continued. "She's been trying to track down the necklace to see if she can buy it back somehow. The pawn shop said it was purchased by a private collector, but they're trying to get contact information." The gesture was something I supposed, though it felt more like damage control than genuine remorse. Getting the necklace back wouldn't undo the violation of trust. Wouldn't erase the months of gaslighting and manipulation. Wouldn't restore the sense of safety I'd lost in my own home. "That's good of her to try," I said carefully, not wanting to discourage any movement toward accountability, while also not wanting to signal that material restitution would be enough to heal what had been broken. "She really is sorry, Mom. She knows she handled everything wrong. Thinks she let her pride and desperation make her do things she never thought she was capable of." I listened to my son defend his wife and felt a familiar ache in my chest. The pain of watching someone you love make excuses for someone who'd hurt them both. Because Jessica's actions had hurt Michael too, had put him in an impossible position and forced him to choose between the people he loved most. "Michael," I said gently, "I need you to understand something. This isn't about the necklace anymore, or even about the other things she took. This is about the fact that she made me doubt my own mind for months. She made me feel like I was losing my memory, like I was becoming the confused old woman everyone fears becoming. That kind of psychological manipulation, it's not something I can just forgive and forget." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was thick, with emotion. "I didn't know about that part," he said. "I mean, I knew she was concerned about your memory, but I thought she was just being protective. She was being calculating. Every time something went missing, she had an explanation that made me question my own perceptions. She was very good at it. God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have seen it, should have protected you." "You couldn't have known?" I said, though part of me wondered if that was entirely true. Had there been signs he'd missed, or had he chosen not to see them because acknowledging them would have complicated his life in ways he wasn't prepared to handle? We talked for another few minutes, carefully navigating around the landmines of blame and responsibility, before ending with promises to talk again soon. But I knew that soon might be longer than either of us hoped, and that our relationship would never quite return to what it had been before Jessica's arrival in our lives. The weeks turned into months, and slowly I began to rebuild not just my physical space, but my sense of self. I reached out to old friends I'd neglected during the chaos of the past year, accepting invitations I'd been too tired or too overwhelmed to consider when my house was full of other people's drama. I started volunteering at the library again, reading to children who reminded me of Emma and Jake, but who weren't weighted down with the complicated emotions of family betrayal. Most importantly, I began seeing a counselor myself, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, who specialized in helping older adults navigate family conflicts and transitions. At first, I'd been reluctant to admit I needed help, but Grace Patterson had gently suggested that talking to someone might help me process not just what had happened with Jessica, but also the larger issues of aging, loss, and changing family dynamics that the theft had brought into sharp focus. Grief has many forms, Dr. Martinez told me during one of our early sessions. You're not just grieving the loss of your mother's necklace, or even your relationship with your daughter-in-law. You're grieving the loss of illusions about family, about safety, about your place in the world as you age. She was right, of course. The necklace had been a catalyst, but the real wound was deeper and more complex. I was mourning the end of my role as the family matriarch, the grandmother whose home was a safe haven for everyone. I was confronting the reality that good intentions and blood relationships weren't enough to guarantee love, respect, or even basic honesty. But I was also discovering strengths I'd forgotten I possessed. The woman who'd stood up to Jessica, who'd refused to be gaslit or manipulated into accepting unacceptable behavior, had been inside me all along. She'd just been buried under layers of grief, loneliness, and the desire to be needed that had made me vulnerable to exploitation. One afternoon, in late spring, nearly 4 months after I'd asked them to leave, I was working in my garden when a car pulled into the driveway. My heart jumped, thinking it might be Michael with the children. But when I looked up, I saw a woman I didn't recognize getting out of a blue sedan. She was probably in her 60s, silver hair and kind eyes, and she approached me with the careful manner of someone who wasn't sure of her welcome. "Mrs. Thompson?" she asked, and I nodded, pulling off my gardening gloves. "My name is Patricia Chen. I believe I have something that belongs to you." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet pouch, and even before she opened it, I knew what I was going to see. The pearls caught the afternoon sunlight like tears, each one perfect and luminous, exactly as I remembered them. "My mother's necklace," I whispered, reaching out to touch the familiar weight of the gold clasp. "I bought it from an estate sale shop 3 months ago," Patricia explained. "I collect vintage jewelry, and when I saw these pearls, I knew they were special. But yesterday I saw a post on Facebook from your daughter-in-law, explaining how the necklace had been sold by mistake and asking if anyone knew where it might have ended up. By mistake." Even in her attempts at restitution, Jessica couldn't bring herself to use the word stolen, couldn't fully acknowledge what she'd done. But I found I didn't care about the precise language anymore. The necklace was here, in my hands, somehow returned to me by a stranger's kindness. "She offered to pay me what I'd paid for it," Patricia continued. "But when I read the story behind the necklace, about it being passed down through 3 generations and meaning so much to your family, I knew I had to return it properly. These kinds of heirlooms belong with their families." I tried to pay her, of course, but she refused any compensation, saying that she was just happy to see the necklace returned to where it belonged. We stood in my driveway for nearly an hour, 2 women who'd never met before bonding over the strange circumstances that had brought us together. After Patricia left, I sat in my living room holding the necklace and marveling at the strange workings of the universe. Jessica's Facebook post had been seen by exactly the right person. Someone who valued family history and heirloom jewelry enough to give up something she'd legitimately purchased. The necklace had found its way back to me through a chain of coincidences. That felt almost magical. But more than that, I realized that getting the necklace back didn't actually change anything fundamental about my relationship with Jessica or even with Michael. The violation of trust remained. The months of manipulation and gaslighting were still part of our history. Okay. And the fundamental character issues that had led to the theft in the first place hadn't been resolved by this gesture of attempted restitution. Still, holding my mother's pearls again felt like receiving a benediction, a sign that some things lost could be recovered, that some wrongs could be partially righted, that the universe occasionally intervened on behalf of justice and family history. That evening, I called Michael to tell him about Patricia's visit. He was amazed by the story, effusive in his gratitude to both the stranger who'd returned the necklace and to Jessica for her efforts to track it down. "Mom, this changes everything," he said, his voice bright with hope. "Jessica's been devastated about the necklace, knowing how much it meant to you. This gives us a chance to start over, to put all of this behind us." I understood his optimism, but I couldn't share it entirely. Getting the necklace back was wonderful, but it didn't erase the fact that Jessica had stolen it in the first place, or that she'd spent months making me doubt my own memory and perceptions. It didn't change the pattern of manipulation and entitlement that had made the theft possible. "I'm grateful to have it back," I said carefully. "And I'm glad Jessica made the effort to find it. But Michael, we need to be realistic about what this means and what it doesn't mean." "What do you mean?" "Mean that returning something you've stolen doesn't automatically repair the relationship with the person you stole from. Trust isn't that simple to rebuild." I could hear the disappointment in his silence, the hope deflating like a punctured balloon. He'd wanted the return of the necklace to be a fairy tale ending, a magical solution that would restore his family to wholeness without anyone having to do the hard work of examining what had gone wrong and why. "So what happens now?" he asked finally. "Now we take it one day at a time. Jessica and I both have work to do if we're ever going to have a healthy relationship again. Getting the necklace back is a good first step, but it's only a first step." The following weeks, Jessica began what seemed like a genuine effort to make amends. She sent me a long letter acknowledging what she'd done wrong, not just the theft, but the gaslighting and manipulation that had accompanied it. She didn't make excuses or blame her desperation for her choices, and she didn't minimize the impact her actions had had on me. The letter was followed by others, updates on the children's lives, photos from school events and family activities, small gestures that felt like attempts to rebuild connection without demanding immediate forgiveness. She was giving me space, while also demonstrating that she was thinking about me, that she understood the relationship needed tending if it was ever going to heal. Michael started visiting on his own sometimes, bringing the children for afternoon visits that were carefully structured to avoid conflict or pressure. We didn't talk about Jessica during these visits, focusing instead on homework help and story reading and all the grandmotherly activities I'd missed so desperately. It wasn't the same as it had been before, of course. There was a carefulness to our interactions now, an awareness of how quickly things could go wrong if we weren't mindful of boundaries and expectations. But slowly, tentatively, we began to rebuild something that felt like family again. The real test came 6 months later when Michael asked if Jessica and the children could come for Emma's birthday dinner. It would be the first time Jessica had been in my house since the night I'd asked them to leave. It's the first time we'd been in the same room since our confrontation in the kitchen. I said yes, but not without considerable anxiety about how the evening would unfold. Jessica arrived looking smaller than I remembered, more subdued and uncertain. She brought flowers and a carefully worded apology, acknowledging again what she'd done and expressing gratitude for my willingness to give her another chance. "I know this doesn't fix everything," she said as I put the flowers in water. "I know I have a lot of work to do to earn back your trust. But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing that work, however long it takes." The evening wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments and careful conversations, times when I could see everyone measuring their words and monitoring their reactions. But Emma was radiant with joy at having her whole family together again, and Jake seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of tension chattering away about his soccer team and his latest art project. As I watched Jessica interact with her children, I saw glimpses of the woman I'd hoped she might be when Michael first brought her home to meet me. She was attentive and patient with them, supportive of their interests and enthusiastic about their achievements. The desperation and entitlement that had driven her to steal from me seemed to have been replaced by something quieter and more grounded. After dinner, while Michael was helping the children with a puzzle in the living room, Jessica and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen loading the dishwasher. It was the first time we'd been alone together since that awful confrontation, and I could feel the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "Eleanor," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to know that I think about what I did every day. It's not just taking your things, but making you doubt yourself, making you feel like you were losing your mind. That was the worst part, and I'm so ashamed of it." I looked at her face, searching for signs of performance or manipulation, but what I saw looked like genuine remorse. The woman who'd casually told me my mother's necklace was just sitting there seemed to have been replaced by someone who understood the magnitude of what she'd destroyed. "I've been seeing a therapist," she continued, "working on understanding why I felt entitled to take things that didn't belong to me. Why I thought it was okay to manipulate you instead of just asking for help. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I want you to know that I'm trying to become someone who could never do those things again." "Good," I said simply, because it was good, even if it didn't automatically repair what had been broken. "I also want you to know that I'm teaching the children about what I did wrong, much appropriately. But I want them to understand that taking things without permission is stealing, even if you're family, even if you think the person won't miss them. I don't want them to grow up thinking that desperation justifies dishonesty." That meant more to me than any apology could have. The knowledge that my grandchildren would learn better lessons from their mother's mistakes than they would have learned from watching her get away with theft and manipulation. "Phew," said, meaning it. The evening ended with cautious optimism rather than restored closeness, but it felt like a beginning. Jessica hugged me goodbye tentatively. Carefully, Anne promised to keep working on herself and our relationship. Micah looked relieved and hopeful in a way I hadn't seen since before their financial troubles began. The children, blessedly, seemed to sense that something important had shifted, that their family was moving toward healing rather than further fracture. As I watched them drive away, I reflected on how much had changed since that morning when I discovered my empty jewelry box. I'd lost my mother's necklace and gotten it back again through the kindness of a stranger. I'd confronted the worst in someone I'd tried to love and seen her begin the long work of becoming better. I'd discovered reserves of strength I'd forgotten I possessed and learned to set boundaries I'd never thought I'd need with family. Most importantly, I'd learned that love without respect isn't really love at all. And that forgiveness without accountability isn't really forgiveness. The woman who'd allowed herself to be gaslit and manipulated for months was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and was willing to fight for it. The road ahead was still uncertain. Jessica and I might never be close the way I'd once hoped we could be. And there would always be a part of me that remembered how easily she'd stolen from me and justified it to herself. But we were building something new on the ruins of what had been destroyed. Something more honest and sustainable than what had come before. And upstairs in my jewelry box, my mother's pearls rested in their appointed place, not just sitting there, gathering dust, but serving as a reminder of the strength that had been passed down through generations of women, for courage to stand up for what mattered, and the wisdom to know when forgiveness was possible and when it was not. The house felt like mine again, filled with my choices and my memories and my hope for whatever came next. I was 74 years old, living alone. and finally at peace with both the solitude and the possibility that family, in whatever form it took, might yet find a way to flourish again. Outside my bedroom window, the same morning light that had revealed my empty jewelry box now illuminated a space that was truly mine again. It's protected by boundaries I'd learned to establish and maintained by the hard-won knowledge that love, let's be real, must be built on a foundation of respect and honesty. The pearls caught the light like promises kept, like prayers answered, like proof that some things lost could indeed be found again, even if they returned to us changed by their journey through the darkness. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this message of strength has traveled. To know that somewhere, someone else who's been made to feel small and forgotten realizes they're not alone. Getting older isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's where the real fight begins, and we're stronger than they think we are.